G'day, I'm Rob.
And I'm Dave.
And you're listening to the Doctor Who show ending the month of October, where tonight, Dave, we are talking Season 25.
Season 25. I'm looking forward to this. And I think based on the feedback we've had, so are a lot of our listeners.
That's right. When we last threw it out to our listeners to do a season, and we said, look, which of these 4 seasons do you want? Season 25 didn't win, but it went pretty close.
It went very close, and we were both very keen to talk about it, so who needs an excuse? It's our podcast. We're talking about what we like, and we're talking about Season 25.
Exactly, and particularly when I looked at the calendar and I thought, this actually debuted in October of 1988, and this is October, so it's a lazy, 32 years ago that it debuted? Let's talk about it in the month of its debut.
Fantastic. No, very keen for this one.
All right, well, we've got a lot to crack through, so let's jump into the news first. Dave, what have you got for us?
So the first item is just an update on the Blu-ray collections, in that there was a tweet circulated earlier this week where a member of the production team said, we are back to recording them. And that explains why, as we've speculated before on the podcast, there have been no announcements about what the next Blu-rays were, because obviously filming of all the extras shut down. And it completely left my mind that there are all these extras that need to be recorded, and docos and interviews and on the couch things, and they couldn't do that. So they have now started recording these again, so hopefully we'll very soon find out what the next one's going to be.
That would be great. I'm really pleased they didn't half-ass it either and go like, we've got to interview, I don't know, Davo, let's get him on Zoom and record that. You know, that would just be awful.
It's interesting you say that, because last month we were talking about how Doctor Who was going to be slower to produce the next season because of COVID requirements and COVID-safe workplaces. And obviously the Blu-rays have been put back as well. But I was listening to Kevin Smith's Fat Man Beyond podcast yesterday, driving home from work, and they were actually talking about the way that some of the TV shows that Hollywood's making at the moment are doing it in a COVID-safe way. And how there were people who were basically hired to work out who there is that would normally be working on the soundstage or in the studio or on the lot, and actually doesn't need to be there, so they're all working from home or from remote locations. Some of them are obvious, like the guys who pay the bills and the guys who do the finances. They don't need to be on the lot, so they can go away. But even people who are in the gallery and actually doing all their work via monitor anyway are actually, in some cases, doing it remotely. And apparently, now this is what they said, I haven't had it first source, but apparently a couple of episodes of the coming season of The Mandalorian were directed by somebody from their home, because as long as you're in front of the monitor and you can see the studio, doesn't matter if the monitor's in your home or in the gallery.
Isn't that amazing? Wow.
Isn't that amazing? So I wonder if anything like that is happening here, or whether they're able, because it's a smaller thing, to all be there. But it was just such an interesting insight, and I guess a lot of things are going to be happening this way. And also there's going to be differences between studio, where you can do that, and location where you don't have a gallery. So you can't do that. So yeah, just a little interesting tidbit that came off that piece of news.
I wonder how many scenes in the next season of Riverdale will be Archie on the phone to people rather than talking in the same room.
Yeah, there'll be a bit of that as well, I suspect.
All right, moving on. A new book is coming out that I'm very interested in, but we'll get to that in a moment because I can't actually get my hands on it. It's Doctor Who Adventures in Lockdown, Dave. A lot of these short stories have come out over the past year. You know, Radio Times would say, oh, look, Stephen Moffat's written a short story, Russell T Davies has written a short story. And here, they're all collected into a book for children in need, along with some new short stories, and this really interests me, from Neil Gaiman, Mark Gatiss, and your favourite, Vinay Patel, Dave.
Oh, I haven't heard anything about that, but my curiosity is now piqued.
Well, don't let it peak too much, because as I said at the start, I can't get my hands on this because it is it's for children in need, and it's meant to only be sold from UK retailers. And I thought, well, off I go to UK Amazon, which is kind of hard to buy stuff from at the moment because there's that whole GST thing.
They're tax dodgers, Rob. You can say it. They're tax dodgers.
There you go. You said it, Dave. And I went to the page for this, and it said, no, this can't ship to your area. And so I looked at Book Depository, which, as we know, is based in the UK and is owned by Amazon, though. They don't even have the book listed. So this is going to become one of these things where I think if people get a whiff of it, they might buy some copies and throw them up on eBay, probably at a slight price hike. I don't care. I think it'll be worth it. I think there's some interesting stuff in there, and it'll be nice to have it in an actual book rather than just reading off a web page.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely curious about that, and I'll check it out myself. I don't know how much I'll pay for one, but I'm certainly curious.
Yeah, look, things can get out of control when people scalp them, but hopefully the goodness in their hearts, they'll look at that cover and see the bandaged bear and see if it's for children in need and not scalp us too badly.
Yeah, it's interesting that being a charity, they're not... Your money and my money is as good for children in need as anybody's money. I wonder if there is actually like a legislative or a tax issue with them being a charity exempt status or something. I don't know what the UK laws are. Maybe that's the issue. But I mean, it is the same reason why, or similar reason, I guess, why Dimensions in Time isn't supposed to be formally released, because you can't make a profit out of something that was done for charity.
Yeah, precisely right. So, look, I'm very interested in this book. Will I get a copy? That remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, keep us updated.
I will do.
Moving on to the mini topics, and I've got the first one for the podcast today. I just wanted to mention that I've been watching some William Hartnell stories.
There's a surprise.
Yeah, I basically had the urge to sit down and watch the Dalek invasion of Earth, because it is one of my top 10 favourite stories. It is my favourite Dalek story. And I did sit down over about 3 evenings and rewatch that, and absolutely enjoyed it. But I just was reminded this is about as bleak as Doctor Who gets. This is an utterly, utterly bleak story. The number of characters that you are introduced to, learn about them, they're fully rounded human beings, and then die horribly is really quite incredible. But even the scale of it, like the number of extras they have up at that mining set in Bedfordshire, and all the stuff with the Daleks going around Westminster. And I actually took it just with my phone, pointing at the TV. I took a clip of about a minute or so of the Daleks around Westminster, and sent it to some of my friends who work in various buildings around Westminster in the UK who are Doctor Who fans, and they were just blown away by it. So that was kind of cool. I also watched The Chase. I enjoyed that. And for the first time in a long time, I watched Galaxy 4.
Oh, okay. And what inspired that?
I just realised that it was a Hartnell story I hadn't watched for a very long time. I mean, I know I saw it for the first time when that bootleg copy was circulating just after it was found. I then watched it when the DVD release came out on the remastered version of the Aztecs. But I don't think I've watched it since. And it was interesting because even though this was the third time I'd seen it, it's the third time in about 10 years. And I actually didn't remember quite a lot of it. So it was really exciting to be watching this episode again, and it's still sort of feeling like a newly recovered episode.
Oh, very nice indeed. Moving on, listeners, if you look at your device, you may see a podcast sitting on there that dropped the day before this podcast dropped, called Primary Sources. Please don't delete it. It's actually something new that we're making here, and I thought I'd talk about it briefly. Some time ago, back on the podcast, we had Bob Fleming from Proctor Who and Jim Cameron from the Crinoid podcast do something called the Letter Lords, where they'd read letters to DWM from that month and talk about them. And Primary Sources is similar yet different. Basically, I'm going to sit down every month and pull out old copies of Doctor Who magazine, say like 20 to 40 years old. So stuff that people were saying about Doctor Who in the 80s and 90s. And not tell my co-host what it's going to be about, what issue I've picked, and then just start reading letters and see what they have to say about them and just riff on the topics that come up in these letters. And Dave, you were very gracious to be the guinea pig for episode 1, which is now on our feed. What did you think of the experience?
It was a very different experience to recording this, because I walked in literally with a blank piece of paper in front of me and just went where my mind wanted to go. And sometimes that was really easy, and there were all sorts of paths I wanted to go down, and sometimes there were less obvious paths to go down. So yeah, it was a very different experience, but it really is just riffing, just chatting.
Yeah, and the plan is to have it come out every 2 weeks after this monthly show drops, so that you'll have a monthly show, 2 weeks later you'll have Primary Sources, 2 weeks after that you'll have another monthly show. So we're going to be in your ears a lot more, and also Dave won't be my co-host on all of these Primary Sources. I will be reaching out there and grabbing other podcasts, as we know, maybe, listeners from our audience, and seeing what other people want to riff about when I start reading these zany letters from the 80s and 90s. And there are some weird things being said in these magazines, it must be said.
Absolutely. And the next time that I'm doing one with you, we've already said that we're going to flip it and you'll be my guest. And I'm going to be pulling them out of the local fanzine. So I'm looking forward to doing that one.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting twist. So, look, please have a listen to it. It's only about 20 minutes long, 22 minutes long. I think that's going to be our average length. Tell us what you think of the podcast.
I think they're quite fun and they'll be very easy listens.
I think so.
Second topic from me, and something else that I've been watching over the last month, I've been dipping back into the Joss Whedon fare. I've been working through Firefly in order, which I sort of do every 5 or 6 years. I go back and watch the whole thing in order, and let's face it, it's only about 18 episodes. It's not hard to do the Great Journey on. And also dipping into sort of episodes in the first couple of seasons of Buffy. Some that I'm big fan of and I really enjoy, others that I actually wouldn't normally dip back into, and I've been trying to make a point of watching ones that I haven't seen in a long time. But what really interested me and what I've really noticed is that these shows feel like they've aged a lot since I last watched them, and it occurred to me that these are shows that are basically 20 years old. Firefly a little less, Buffy a little more, particularly those early seasons. And for somebody who obviously grew up watching the Crotons and the Power of Kroll and Blake Seven and all the rest of it, I thought at the time that stuff like Buffy and Firefly were incredibly well made with amazing special effects. Even though they weren't, Star Trek League, they were very, very good. I watch them now, though, and I can see the pieces moving in a way I never could before.
Yeah.
You can look at some of the effects and see, wow, that's a really dodgy effect now by the modern standards. It looks really crap. You can also sort of notice things like where they stake a vampire who falls out of shot so they don't have to use the expensive dusting effect. There was one episode I watched where I've never seen it before, I swear, but suddenly I realised that you can see the join where the top of the monster costume has clearly been put onto this guy and doesn't meet with the pants of the costume that have been put on. And many other examples like that. Or, you can see where Buffy being thrown across the room is clearly a physical effect where she's been pulled on a wire. It's not CGI. I mean, it's still great. I still love them and they're not bad. But I just thought it was really interesting to see them now getting into this zone of looking old in the way that when we grew up with Classic Who, it looked old. And I do wonder if somebody who was 16 now and turned on to watch Buffy would just go, this is really badly made. Or would it be watchable? I'm genuinely curious. But yeah, it just struck me that series do age. Doctor Who isn't the only series that looks shoddier the older it gets, if you know what I mean.
Oh, I do. But it happens so incrementally and slowly over time that it's always shocking when you finally realise it.
It really is, yeah.
What could we watch today? I don't know, The Boys. Look at the effects in The Boys. And it's like, oh, well, that's quite good. That's a superhero-looking effect. Wow. Great for TV. But when will that look dated? In 20 years' time, will that just look ridiculous to us? Isn't that scary to think? Because what will TV look like in 20 years' time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I said it before, but the last time I did a Harry Potter rewatch, the first one of those, there's still some effects that look amazing, but there are others. The Quidditch tournament particularly, where you look at that and go, that actually was very early CGI, and it looks it.
Yeah, agree. Shall we move on?
Yeah, what have you got for us, Rob?
Finally, just a quick one. Sometimes I throw out tweets that are a little controversial, and this is the one that got the most traction over the past month. I'll just read the whole tweet to you, Dave, and then we can talk about it. There's a lot I don't understand in fandom and never will. Top of the list for a couple of decades is the pathological hatred some fans have for being called Whovians. Never thought of it as a really awesome word, but similarly never thought it needed hating either. ? And my God, didn't people jump in on this? Many people saying, yeah, I don't see a problem with it. Other people saying, well, it's because the Americans created it and I don't want to be an Americanism and, and just going crazy about it. And I thought, oh my God, I've lit a powder keg here. Dave, Whovians.
It's not a term I personally would ever use, but it's not a term that I get remotely worked up about at all. I was very interested to see and read what the feedback was from those who do get worked up by it. I kind of have a theory that people don't necessarily like to be defined by being a Doctor Who fan, in the same way that a lot of people reject from a lot of things, whether they're innate attributes or hobbies or whatever. They don't want to be defined as just that. That's just something that they like and they're happy to enjoy it, but it's not who they are. I wondered whether consciously or subconsciously there was a take on that, and that didn't really come through, though. As I say, I've never felt the need to have a collective word for Doctor Who fans. I think the term Doctor Who fans works. That's how I would describe myself. I am a Doctor Who fan. I've always thought that it was kind of the poor cousin to Trekkies, in that Trekkies had that cool word. You know, they were Trekkies, and some people thought, well, if they've got a cool word, we need a cool word. And maybe there is a bit of a split there between the US and the UK. Don't know, but...
yeah, it did seem to be a UK-US kind of thing, and I kind of felt sitting down here at the end of the world, almost like in a tennis match, just watching them lob sort of comments at each other, like... You know,
yeah.
One side saying, I don't see the big deal, and the other side saying, no, we can't be this, oh, it's horrible, you know, Americanisms, yeah. And I think that's that way in a lot of things. I think we sit down here in Australia and we take the best of British and we take the best of the US, and we don't give a bugger about the rest of it. And I think maybe here too it could be the same. I don't know. After I asked it and got all these replies, I thought, oh, gee, this is a bigger topic than I actually thought it was.
It is also very Australian to not get worked up about something.
That is true as well, actually.
So maybe we are in the sweet spot on that one.
Yeah. Anyway, that was just a quick one from me.
No, that was very entertaining. Thank you.
All right, Dave. The time has come. Season 25. Shall we discuss it?
Can I start with a bit of scene setting, Rob?
Yes, please. It's always a good way to start.
So, Season 25 came at a really interesting time, I think, for fandom generally, but Australian fandom in particular. Let me start by saying the McCoy era is probably the one era that I can remember watching as a kid clearly. I have memories of the Colin Baker era and memories of the Dave A era, but they are young kid memories, you know, images and scenes and stuff. They're not coherent in the way the McCoy era was. But there was a big change when the McCoy era landed in Australia, a really fundamental change in the way that it was treated by the ABC. As anybody who listens to Australian podcasts know, traditionally Doctor Who went out Monday to Friday or Monday to Thursday in that 6 to 7 p.m. block where it was all about family viewing, you know, safe British sitcoms, Doctor Who, the goodies, just churned out while people were making dinner, eating dinner, before you led into the nightly news at 7 o'clock, and then you had, in inverted commas, adult programming. It was the family slot. With the McCoy era, though, that changed, and Doctor Who was moved to a 5:30 slot, which put it in the middle of basically a magazine-type show called The Afternoon Show, which was an hour, sometimes an hour and a half of not kids programming, but teen programming, very much young adult programming. It was basically aimed for the kids are home from school, the parents aren't home from work yet, put them in front of the telly. So instead of being paired with family sitcoms and classics, now the show was being paired with things like The Ghost of Motley Hall, or Press Gang, or The Mysterious Cities of Gold, or You Can't Do That on Television.
That's right.
A much different demographic, and there was a real feeling that Doctor Who had gone downhill now, and that, you know, you had a sort of a up and coming, maybe having a bit of a trial on TV radio presenter like James Valentine and Michael Dunn producing them. This wasn't being done seriously. The other thing, of course, was that season 24 landed so badly.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about how you remember season 24 and the McCoy years sort of landing at that early stage, Rob?
Well, initially it landed for me on tapes coming over from the UK, because season 24 wasn't shown here in any way sort of quickly after the UK. So it was up to going into Sydney University to Doctor Who Club of Australia parties, as they were called, and watching tapes there in university lecture rooms on the TV monitors there. So that's where I saw season 24 originally, surrounded by fans, some of whom really liked what they were seeing, others just completely shocked and stunned by what they were seeing. And then, though, by the time it came around onto television, Well, to me it was old hat, but I think to people who hadn't been going to these Doctor Who club parties, because let's face it, that's a fairly small niche of people.
Yeah, 30 or 40 people, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it was, I think, a shock for the general TV public. McCoy was a sort of a clowning sort of doctor. The show seemed a bit childish, and it was in that childish slot, which is where I think you've set up that conversation for us to have, that it was just in a completely different place to where it had been in the past, even as recently as Trial of a Time Lord.
Yeah, and I think that season 24 has to some extent been redeemed. People can see what the production team was trying to do. They can see where it was heading. There are some very good story concepts in there, yes. But I think it would be tough to argue it was clearly rushed into production. It clearly didn't have the script work it had needed. McCoy certainly did not have the time to develop his character in 14 episodes, and it looked cheap. It just looked phenomenally cheap.
Yeah, agree.
So where we were fortunate in Australia is that, as you said, season 24 was so far delayed that when it came out and everybody was sort of working their way through that and like, oh, Paradise Towers, that looked a bit shoddy, and Delta and the Bannerman, that's just childish. Dragonfire here, not too bad, but all in all, this is a bit cheap and nasty. This new Ace character looks good. But we then got, the next day, Remembrance of the Daleks Part 1.
We did. We
actually had season 24 end on a really high note, and suddenly, well, we'll talk about Remembrance of the Daleks in a moment and that transition, but we did get that story at the very end of season 24. They then had a shorter break than usual, and then we got it again on the whole of season 25, although, as I'll discuss as we get into it, I did see a couple of those early at the local club here. Anything you want to add on that before we actually go into the stories, Rob?
Yes, Dave, I do want to tell my time-honoured story of being on the afternoon show before Remembrance came on. I have told this story before, so I'll run over it really quickly. Basically, I was in the Doctor Who Club of Australia, and we got a little contingent together. The afternoon show said, let's do a quiz before each episode of Remembrance of the Daleks to celebrate the 25th anniversary. So I went in there, and some other guys from my local club went in there. Kate Orman went in there. Dallas Jones, who was the president of the club at the time, went in there. And most of us ended up in this wacky sort of quiz segment before Remembrance would air. So for the first 3 episodes, there were 3 rounds with 3 people in them. And then before the 4th episode, the winner of those first 3 rounds, they went into a playoff. And I wasn't in that group. I've got to say, my group, there was myself, 13-year-old me, dressed as Davo, my mate from high school, Harvey, he was 14, and he was dressed as Colin Baker. And then sitting to the side of us was this guy who must have been in his mid-30s, wasn't dressed up at all, just this dishevelled old bloke. And when my mum saw the footage, she said, what's that old guy doing on TV with you kids? That's weird. And naturally he won, because we're just these kids, like in our first flush of fandom, whereas he's got like 20 years of fan knowledge up his sleeve, and he just blew us away and ended up in the final.
Yeah, I remember watching those actually go to air. I remember a couple of the questions. There was one that was a who is this question, and a photo was put up of Anthony Ainley, and the correct answer was Chameleon, because he was obviously in his Planet of Fire one. I remember that one being, at the age of 8, I remember that being a slightly dodgy trick question. But the one that really stands out for me is where James Valentine, who was hosting it, and did not like Doctor Who. That was very clear from the presenter of this show. He was not interested in Doctor Who at all, and he particularly hated Doctor Who fans writing in to tell him what he was getting wrong, and that was a recurring thing. In fact, if you allow me to diverge quickly, there was one time where they had a competition of send in your design of what the TARDIS should become instead of a police box. Let's modernise it. And I remember James Valentine going on the show one day and saying, Doctor Who fans, I know why it's stuck as a police box. I know that the chameleon circuit's broken. We're just trying to have some fun. Stop writing in telling me.
That's fabulous.
But I remember he asked a question, who were the 2 resis in Paradise Towers? And someone, it might have been Dallas actually, said, Tilda and Tabby. And James Valentine said, well, my card here says Tilda and Tibby. And the people on the show had to actually say to him, no, it actually is right. It is Tilda and Tabby. And it's like, dude, this show went out last week on your program. You clearly did not watch it.
Yeah. Oh, look, I have lots of good memories of it. I mean, it was dodgy. They did the Who quiz 2 times. They did it the following year as well with different people. But the first year where I did it, we had squeaker toys as the buzzers. We were like squeezing like dog sort of chew toys, that would make a noise. It was all very strange. I remember getting given The Five Doctors on VHS by James Valentine as a prize. This was off screen when we all sort of, finished filming. He came around and was handing out videos. I remember Kate Orman. They had a prop Dalek from the BBC, on loan from the BBC, probably BBC Enterprises or something out here. And Kate tried to open it up because she was like, well, we can take the lid off and we can get inside. And she got told off. We didn't get inside the Dalek, unfortunately. So I have all these strange sort of memories of it. But yeah, look, I was 13. I was in love with the show. I was way into fandom. I was dressing up as Davo. But what is interesting, and this is pertinent to Australian fandom and people watching Doctor Who overall, is it didn't seem that big a deal outside of that. And I only remembered this part this afternoon when I was making a few notes for the show. And that's that my maths teacher, Mr. Hogan, had recorded the afternoon show thing with me on it. And in class, in math, he said, oh, I've got a video I'm going to show you people. And he put it on, and it was like me on TV dressed as Davo answering Doctor Who questions. And I seem to recall the kids were pretty nonplussed, and some didn't even really understand what was going on. I mean, this is me on TV. This surely should have been a big deal, but apparently not. And I think Doctor Who was a bit like that here at the end of the 80s. It wasn't the cultural phenomenon that every kid would watch. That had happened 10 years earlier. That's like a 1978 kind of thing. By 1988, yeah, the kids at my school were showing me on TV dressed as Davo, and they just had no idea what I was doing.
No, as I say, I was 8, so getting at the end of year 2 when season 24 and the start of season 25 was shown here. And I reckon there was maybe 1, maybe 2 other kids in my class who watched Doctor Who. It just was irrelevant.
There you go.
So, before we dive into the stories particularly, I think we should have a bit of a look at season 25. And I think the thing that stands out for me is season 24 having been rushed into production through the fault of nobody other than BBC management, who told J&T, you're not going to be back next year, go away on holiday. He comes back, oh, Doctor Who's back, you've got 3 weeks to cast a doctor, find 4 scriptwriters, find 4 directors, find a script editor,
Yep.
That is not J&T's fault. That's very, very clear. So that is a rush season. It's got its gems, but it is a rush season. Season 25, though, feels like what a new debut season for a Doctor should feel like. McCoy suddenly knows what he wants to do with the Doctor. The companion suddenly is working for the Doctor. I'm sure we'll talk about Ace. Andrew Cartmel clearly has had the time to actually find the writers he wants to work with and work with them on developing stories and doing those extra polishes of the scripts to make them good. And it feels like there's money there now. Not a lot, but compared to season 24 and frankly even Trial of a Time Lord, it looks like there's money there now.
Agree with all of that. And I mean, you brought up Andrew Cartmel, and I think he looms large behind all of this.
Yes.
Just new ideas from him is just so important for this era. And when we sort of swing into what he can really do in his second and third seasons, it's really quite amazing stuff. I do want to bring up something, though, which I think is really fascinating, which I read recently and I tucked it away in my memory. And I think Andrew Cartmel is, we can both agree, a different sort of person to Eric Saward. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They approach their craft in very different ways.
Absolutely. And so by the time season 25 came around, his feet were under the desk, his mates were writing all the stories, and he was going to do whatever he pleased, which included bringing more social issues to Doctor Who, which might sound strange because Doctor Who's always had social issues, but I think Cartmel had even more of a social conscience than past script editors. And also, this is what I want to talk about in particular, black representation. Because on the face of it, Dave, this seems like a good thing. I mean, good grief, Hollywood is still crying out for black representation in some areas, more than 30 years after, season 25 of Doctor Who. But when you start to scratch the surface, it's a bit first we have the guy in the cafe doing the late night shift. It's not Harry, it's Harry's mate, because Harry's gone off to have the twins with his wife.
It's Jeffrey from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Is it really?
I'm pretty sure it is, yeah.
Good God. Well, that wasn't going to be my point. My point is that he tells the Doctor how his grandfather was a slave and he was sold in Kingston, otherwise he'd be an African, and that's quite interesting and realistic. But then you fast forward to the next story, which is the Happiness Patrol, and the only black guy in the show is the guy who, of course, can play the blues on his harmonica. Then we get to Silver Nemesis, and they jam the Cybermen with jazz, which is obviously an African-American form of music, and Courtney Pine is in the episode. Then we get to the greatest show in the galaxy, and oh great, we've got a black guy on the cast, and he's the rappin' ringmaster. Now, you line all of these up, and it starts to look very stereotypical. Compare it, you'll appreciate this, compare it to, say, Earl Cameron playing Williams in The 10th Planet. There's a black man in Doctor Who, and he doesn't rely on playing the blues or jazz, he doesn't rap, he's not a slave. It's actually very progressive, given there were no black astronauts at the time, for a 1966 episode to say, here's the future, and look, here's a black astronaut. And I think we did get black astronauts around 1983, so Doctor Who was quite good at predicting the future. All of that said, though, I think what he's doing is heartfelt. I think it's very important. I don't think he'd want to stereotype people in a million years. Yet you line up these 4 episodes, these 4 shows together from season 25, and it's like, oh, that looks a bit stereotyping. That's odd. I think today it'd get smashed on Twitter, big time.
You're probably right about that last point. And let me just say quickly, I've got the article in front of me, and Joseph Marcel definitely was in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'm not wrong about that.
Uh-huh.
Look, what you're saying is obviously correct. I think there's a little bit of coincidentalness about it, in that I suspect that Andrew Cartmel was a jazz fan, and therefore he's thrown a lot of jazz in there. And it's ended up being that those two intents have kind of crossed over. Earl Sigma, yes, he does play the blues, but he's also a medical student, and he's a very competent sort of person, and the fact that he's black is actually irrelevant to his character. The fact that the ringmaster is black, okay, he gets the lame rap, but I suspect that's more about the circus being lame than about him being black. Maybe I'm looking for excuses, I don't know. But I guess, given the absolute low bar that Doctor Who is coming off in the early 80s in terms of minority representation, yes, points for going in the right direction.
Oh, yeah, and I do want to emphasise that. I don't think Cartmel is doing anything but doing a very heartfelt thing, which I think is very good. I just feel that you get 4 black actors in 4 stories, and they're all doing, quotation marks, black things, rather than, say, Earl Cameron being an astronaut or, whatever. But
yeah,
that's just the way I see it.
Yeah, you're not wrong, and I mean, without knowing what was in different people's minds, you can't judge. You're right to point it out, and it is better than it was, not as good as it could have been. The other thing I just want to touch on as well, and you mentioned it there a bit there, Rob, is the writers that are coming into this season. One thing that Andrew Cartmel does do that a lot of script editors before him have struggled to do, frankly, is to bring a whole new cadre of writers onto the show. And they're all, for the most part, those young, up-and-thrusting writers bursting with new ideas, wanting to change the world, wanting to make a difference, not necessarily knowing their craft all that well. And many of them will admit that now. You listen to the commentary with Andrew Cartmel and Ben Aronovich on Battlefield, and both of them basically say, with 25 years of hindsight as writers, they can see all the things they did wrong structurally and technically in their writing for Doctor Who now. Or Doctor Who as it was then, if you know what I mean. And they're very open about that. But it still brings a freshness to these last couple of years that just hasn't been there for quite a while. And that's a really, really cool thing. And I want to highlight the writers as we go through these stories.
Absolutely. And I'll just say for Aronovich, this was his first TV script, full stop. First.
Yeah, so look, that's absolutely amazing, and maybe let's use that to segue into Remembrance of the Daleks, which, as we say, we saw twice right at the end of Dragonfire, which was very, very cool.
Yes.
Instantly, with that story, this season feels like something special and like a big step up. it starts with what is almost a unique thing for Doctor Who, which is a pre-credits cold open of a spaceship moving into orbit over the planet Earth before the credits. Now, that just says to you, this is going to be big, this is going to be a bit special. Almost within the first couple of minutes, you get things like, there's a Dalek. Like there's none of this, oh, we'll hold the Daleks back for the first cliffhanger. No, you get in, it's called Remembrance of the Daleks. In 5 minutes, you've got a Dalek. You've got a Dalek's point of view with the cool computer graphics. You've got that moving laser beam with the skeleton effect, which, like, for anybody who wasn't there in 1988, the Dalek point of view and that gun effect, that laser effect, that skeleton effect, that was a bloody big deal.
Oh, yeah. It still looks good today, Dave.
It does. It was such a step up from what had gone before. And suddenly we've got action, we've got characters, we've got a cast that is, pretty impressive. Pamela Salem and Simon Williams are there right from the get-go. You've got Dursley McLinden, who looks very, very good in the role and is a really good character. Within 10 minutes of that story, you've got excitement, adventure, and really wild things happening, and it looks pretty cool. And that was just incredible. From a first-time writer.
And a quick shout-out, too, to Tipping, the stunt guy, who actually died not long after this was made, I don't think, in a parachute accident.
Yeah, 1990, I reckon he died, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of years. Tipping, the way he throws himself back into that corrugated iron, even that looks like a stunt that wouldn't have been done on Doctor Who a year or two earlier.
Yeah.
Even though they've had stuntmen on the show before. Action by Havoc, I get all of that. They were just running around shooting guns a lot of the time, not sort of throwing themselves bodily into corrugated iron fences.
Absolutely. You've got Ace using a rocket launcher. The episode builds to a big climax where a Dalek climbs the stairs. And to outdo that, the episode 3 cliffhanger, an entire bloody Dalek shuttlecraft lands in a school playground. They built a Dalek shuttlecraft and lowered it into a school playground. I don't know whether they just had more money or they were just spending it better, but this looks good.
Do you want me to spoil that for you in a story sense?
Sure.
The shuttlecraft has clearly landed there before because the scorch marks are on the ground and the Doctor goes over and examines them.
Yes.
When it lands, it blows out all the windows in the school. Did that not happen the first time? Or did it happen and they repaired all the windows and not realising what did it? And then it lands again.
Well, they've got the headmaster under their control, so he would have just said it was gangs or something, I guess.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Probably hippies.
It's a bit early for hippies. Teddy boys.
I don't know. I'm sure someone was protesting something in 1963, surely. but yeah, okay, fair enough.
Dave, when I saw this, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I still can't fully believe it now because it looks nothing like the season before it or even the seasons before it. It's incredible. It's like, how did this happen? How are you guys capable of this? You've given us Time Flight, you've given us Time Lash. Even when you had money, you gave us the 2 Doctors. Why? How? But the stink of it is that people had started giving up on Doctor Who, some in Davo's era, some in Colin's era, quite a few after Sylvester's first season. And sure, new fans emerge every year to sort of help pad the numbers. But there was this net effect, I think, of older fans who probably would have quite enjoyed seeing this, and they didn't see it. And it was perhaps some time before word of mouth got to them, and maybe they got the VHS or something. Maybe there are still fans who gave up on Doctor Who in the mid-80s and still haven't seen this because they just gave up. I don't know.
A combination of giving up, but also the time slot. If you're somebody who's just finished school, or even if you're in the last couple of years of school, 5:30 is not a time you're usually home to watch television. I know a lot of friends who had sort of grown up with the show, and by this stage they just finished school and then their first job, and they didn't get home till 6 o'clock, so they weren't watching Doctor Who, which is a shame. Another memory of mine watching this is I was absolutely convinced that the creature with the strange voice in the corner of Ratcliffe's thing, I was absolutely certain that was Davros.
Yes.
I was blown away when it turned out to not be Davros, but to be the little schoolgirl. And then Davros turns up where you didn't expect him.
In the Emperor shell, yeah.
In the Emperor shell. So, look, it was probably incredibly obvious which was which, to an adult watching that, but as an 8-year-old, that bait and switch completely worked for me.
I can tell we're both very excited by this, but I will throw up a negative, Dave.
Sure.
The whole blowing up of Skaro thing doesn't sit well with me. Now, as a kid, I thought, oh, this is fabulous. This is great. This doctor, he's not a pussy. He fights these Daleks, normally, and it's the space equivalent of like people having a little slap fight for 30 seconds and then running away. But this was like, holy hell, he's blown up Skaro. Doesn't he blow up the whole system it's in or something? It's like, Jesus Christ, this is amazing. But as I've gotten older, I guess I'm not wowed when it's like, oh, we're going to blow up the Starship Enterprise for the 10th time, or oh, we're going to destroy Gallifrey again on New Who, to bring an example closer to home. I look at these destroying big things as being a bit cheap in stories now. And so I look at destroying Skaro as possibly the only thing in this story that gives me a bit of pause. It just seems a little out of character for the Doctor, given the way he has dealt with the Daleks in the past.
It's very interesting because it's very clear the production team, and particularly the writer, is treating the show with a certain amount of reverence. You get things like the little reference to the French Revolution book that Susan had in An Unearthly Child, or the mention, oh, but you said the Doctor was an old geezer with white hair. You get all those lovely little bits that are perfectly dropped in. They're not alienating a casual audience, but they're wonderful for a fan. So there's a reverence to the show there. But there is also this kind of contra attempt to make a mark on the show. Blowing up Skaro here. Ben Aronovich wanted to kill the Brigadier in Battlefield next season. In the end, he pulled back from it. But there is that kind of young enthusiasm to make a mark. And this is the best way they know how to. And I do wonder if you said to Cartmel and Aronovich 20 years later, would you change the ending? I wonder if they perhaps would, with a bit more hindsight and experience, know that you don't have to blow everything up at the end to make an impact.
I'd like to think they would. I'd like to think they could do something cleverer than just, a big explosion,
Final point from me, and that is that it is very, very clear here the message that Cartmel and the team want to push, in that you have the Daleks overtly linked to the Nazis, you have a neo-Nazi white supremacist group that are clearly the bad guys, to the point of Mike Smith, who has been a romantic interest for Ace, who has been an identification character in some ways for the audience. He's been a good guy. Suddenly he's turning around and doing the whole, you've got to get rid of the others so your own can have a fair go. You've got the scene where Ace finds the no coloured sign in the window of his mum's house. Again, as a kid, you kind of get the vibe of it, which is the right way for it to be done. As an adult, you get exactly what they're doing. And I think it strikes that balance of giving you a tone without really ramming it home. And beyond everything, it kind of doesn't matter in some ways. Well, I suppose it does matter, but regardless of whether the message is important to you or not, you've got lots and lots and lots of Daleks blowing a lot of stuff up.
My final comment will be, I think Aronovich actually wanted to go further. I have read that Rachel was, I think, going to originally be like a Dr. Israel. It was going to be that on the nose, showing the contrast. But they pulled back from that, so it was going to go even further at one stage.
Speaking of things that were going to go even further at one stage...
Yes.
Are we going to talk about the Happiness Patrol?
Dave, as a kid, I absolutely hated this. It just felt so try-hard. The city looked like a set. It had that stupid buggy thing that goes about 2 kilometres an hour, even though they've had things like that in recent seasons, and they've been shown to look stupid on screen, yet they've still got one. Painting the TARDIS pink, I thought, was genuine heresy. The Happiness Patrol concept seemed very stupid to me. This concept of being killed for just a moment's unhappiness in some cases, decided upon in a really arbitrary kind of way. That seemed very unrealistic. When I got older, though, I could see past the literal, I could see the allegory, the homages. I enjoyed it a lot more. I still don't think it's perfect by any means, but it's this odd little thing, and I think the 3-part nature makes it just zip along and, an end before it gets too much into, let's just run up and down corridors to pad out an episode. I think it's okay. There's my opening gambit.
I agree with a lot of what you've said. I quite liked it as a kid. I didn't love it, but I appreciated it for being the fun little story that it was. I liked the Candyman, again, as a fun kind of villain. But yet, like you, both as I've grown older and as I've seen it many more times, I have come to appreciate it on a different level. The Candyman goes from being sort of a kind of fun concept to actually just being really fun and cool. And that moment when he picks up the phone, Candyman,
yes.
I just crack up every time I see that. I don't know why.
Is it the style of phone, maybe? Because it's an
style
old-fashioned
of phone. It's the way he does it. The way he's just so grumpy at everybody. I really do like the Candyman. I think he's a wonderful creation. But you're right. When you see what the story's trying to say, and that he's actually trying to say, we'll get to that in a moment, I think, and you realise that it is simply a form of oppression. And although the concept of being executed for being sad seems on the face of it to be a silly one, when you realise that all of the tools of oppression are fundamentally ridiculous, except for the fact that they're deadly, you get that, and you see the superficiality of it. The first time anybody, I think, sees the costume and makeup and the wigs of the Happiness Patrol themselves, it seems almost puerile. But when you realise that's part of the fakeness and the veneer of the society and the oppression of the society, it becomes really clever. But you need to watch it on multiple occasions to really appreciate what it's doing.
I think that's brought home where, I don't know which member of the Happiness Patrol it is, but she's got the rifle. But it looks like something out of Willy Wonka's factory. It looks like something you'd, squirt, I don't know, vanilla icing onto cupcakes with. And Ace says, why can't you get a real gun? And then she turns around and blows out a street light with it. And Ace is like, Gordon Bennett or something, appropriately Ace-like. I guess that's showing that, they're carrying these weird, odd-looking weapons, but they are actually deadly, and they will kill you.
Yeah, so look, let's talk then about the roots of the story. It's written by Graham Curry. It's the only story that he does for Doctor Who, brought in by Andrew Cartmel. When he and Andrew Cartmel, and I think this is common knowledge, when they sat down to work through the story, they said, this is the one that's going to take down Margaret Thatcher. At this stage, she'd been Prime Minister of the UK for 9 years. She just won her third election in 1987. And they said, this is going to be a piece of satire that's going to take down Margaret Thatcher. They take it to John Nathan Turner, who just, has a mini stroke when he hears this. And sort of says to them, guys, the BBC wants nothing more than to get us off the air. You want to do a program attacking the government. That's all the excuse they'll need to take us off air. That's not what we do. Can you take all the Thatcher stuff out? So they do. I think there's a couple of hints in there. I kind of wonder whether the sugar factories that they talk about were going to have a bigger role and be analogous to the coal mines, for example. I think that might be a hint of it there, but they take it all out. Sheila Hancock is then cast to play Helen A and says, this is an evil woman running a planet. She reminds me of Margaret Thatcher. I'm going to do it as Margaret Thatcher. So the satire in the portrayal is there.
Yes.
But I don't think that as a takedown of Thatcherism, it really works. What Terra Alpha is far more like a Pinochet regime in Chile or the Ceausescu regime in Romania, which was going to be overthrown about 12 months after this went out. It was a horrific regime that was nearing the end of its life. A regime like those ones in the 80s where dissidents just disappeared.
Yeah.
And, look, like Thatcher, don't like Thatcher, we can have that argument another time. She was not a dictator who disappeared her people in the way that a Pinochet or a Ceausescu or a Hussein or any number of those sort of 80s dictators would have done. So I think that as a takedown of oppression, this is actually a far more important work than just a kind of fun satire of Margaret Thatcher. And that's what I wanted to say. But to a sort of a lighter tone, this is possibly the best cast story of at least the McCoy years, probably anything sort of in the late 80s, really. I mean, Sheila Hancock, Ronald Fraser, Georgina Hale, Harold Innocent, Leslie Dunlop, John Normington. I mean, that is an incredible cast of name actors.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about Remembrance having a good cast, but I think this would pip it, for sure.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I mean, they're all big name actors. I mean, Leslie Dunlop, she was a big sitcom actor at the time and went on to some even bigger work as well off the back of this.
One thing I want to mention, the killing of the guy with, is it strawberry fondant? Always seemed very shocking to me in general, because it seems like, oh, look, he's drowned in this tube and then the body flops out like a dead fish, and isn't that terrible, But then later I realised this is actually meant to be hot. This is meant to be like scalding hot strawberry fondant. So this guy's not only drowned, he's been scalded by that as well. And it's like, this is kids' television. And again, this is going out on the ABC at 5:30 in the afternoon. Wow. The more you dig, the more it's like, ooh, there's a lot more going on here than it first seems.
It is. It's one of those things that I think as you age, your view of it changes. Like as a kid, you sort of go, oh, wow, that's a cool, gruesome death. Then you sort of go, wow, that's actually really quite nasty. And then you kind of really appreciate the kind of the metatextual nature of it and the references to it, and even just the black humour to it that I think, comes with age. I love that little exchange where the Candyman's talking to the doctor about, sweets that are so powerful that the human body is incapable of understanding the pleasure of them. And he goes on and he says, just tell me what I'm trying to say, Gilbert. He makes sweets that kill people. It's just such a wonderful line. And you've got Harold Innocent delivering it. It's just really, really good. It's a fun story. It's probably the cheapest looking of them for this season. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the things that, again, annoyed me as a kid. Like, I can't believe this is a town or a city. This is a set. Like they've filmed a panto or something. This is ridiculous. But then, when you watch it, as an adult, you can appreciate that sort of fake look to it. Or in the candy kitchen when there's all those shadows of the cogs turning and things like that. And it takes on that more sort of German expressionist sort of theatre of the 1920s or something. It's like, oh wow, that's very good.
Yeah, it is the cheap studio one. And I think that if it was made today, it probably would look more expensive but similar, but there would be that line or that sort of comment about, oh look, we're in a planetary dome, and they'll probably have something like they had in the Impossible Planet. Look out the window there's the space, the atmosphere can't be even. So that sort of contextualizing it, that this is a colony that's sort of all inside. I think that's how they'll do it now.
Yeah, I agree.
Silver Nemesis, Rob.
Yes, do you want to lead us on this one?
I saw Silver Nemesis go out live. It wasn't when I saw it at the club early.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of sort of context and a bit of backstory in here. About a year after The Curse of Fenric came out, it famously got a release on VHS where they put about another 10 or 15 minutes of footage into the story, and suddenly Curse of Fenric went from being, that was a really well-made story, but I have no idea what it was about, to, hey, it suddenly all makes sense. This is awesome. And then about 6 months later, they said, oh, we're going to do the same thing with Silver Nemesis. And I remember a lot of fans around the club got very excited. They thought, finally, this is actually we're going to work out what they were trying to do, and it's going to all make sense. And then the extended version of Silver Nemesis came out, and everyone said, no, it still doesn't make sense. And that's the context in which I want to open the discussion. Rob, what do you think?
Oh, there are so many things to say about this, Dave. Gosh, where will I start? I got 2 big points to start with. I'll start with this one. I think comedy shoots this one in the foot the most, because we have a plot that, I'm not being profound to say it's not dissimilar to Remembrance in some ways. And yes, Cartmel should have been dragged over coals for that. How can you not notice that the Doctor has some device from ye olde times that he's going to shoot up into space and destroy one of his biggest enemies with? It's similar in so many ways. Yet it has all this comedy stuff too, like the skinheads and Mrs. Remington and the Queen. And, it buggers up a story which is already a little shaky in terms of what exactly is meant to be happening and what's the Doctor's motivation. It seems to change from episode to episode. I'll say Remembrance has humour too, but I think it's done so much better and doesn't stop the story from being taken seriously than the humour here does. Like, in Remembrance, I think of that scene where they drive through the dark underpass and the Doctor and Sophie, Sylvester and Sophie, change seats. And there's this very surprised look on her face. It's this nice visual gag, and that's fine. But in this, you have the skinheads talking about social workers and Mrs. Remington, being played by this American who no one's ever heard of.
Except J&T.
Except J&T, and that was meant to be a big deal. Oh, no. The comedy kills it in places. And I know the story's not up to snuff either.
I'm going to invert what you're saying there, Rob. Mm-hmm. Because I think that the comedy saves it.
Really?
I think that this is a story that doesn't quite work. It has too many disparate elements that don't quite work out. Lady Painfort on her own would be an amazing villain. She doesn't quite get what she deserves and gets a bit ranty at the end. The Cybermen are very much underdone. It's cool to see them. They get some good moments, but they're underdone. The Nazis, again, a whole story with DeFlores would have been quite cool, but he sort of turns up, says a few Nazi things, and by sort of part 3 he's vanished, particularly in the non-extended version. It is a bit of a mess. It is a bit lightweight. So putting the comedy in there means that if you kind of just accept this is going to be a bit silly and a bit fun, you can enjoy this story. And I think if it was trying to do this story in a po-faced manner, it actually would be really, really bad. But at least there's a sense of light-hearted fun in this one that certainly carries me through.
Oh, look, I do enjoy some of the comedy. I'd say most of the Lady Painfort comedy is actually my favourite sort of stuff. Just some of her asides to Richard, I think are very, very funny.
Yes.
But yeah, there's other bits that I just don't think they're needed. The other big point I was going to make, you've already mentioned the Nazis. I was very surprised by this as a kid, because it does start with all that Nazi stuff, like in DeFlores' office, and he's got all the gear on his table, all the paraphernalia. And I was like, gosh, you can't show Nazis in a kid's show. It felt very weird to me. Right. It also felt very brave and daring that Doctor Who was doing this. There was part of me as a 13-year-old back in 1988 that felt that this was really weird that Doctor Who would be doing this. So I found it interesting. As a Cyberman fan, though, I'll also mention I wasn't too pleased with how they came across. They were still just lumbering around and slow and a bit stupid. And I guess they're easier to direct when they're like that. There's a few moments of menace, like when they march en masse at the Nazis and they're firing their guns and stuff, but generally, I guess it's all undercut by the gold stuff as well, which we haven't mentioned.
Yeah, I think that the arrival of the Cybermen is very cool. That cliffhanger is really well done. There are, again, a lot of them. They look good, I think. They've got big costumes, that classic 80s Cyberman costume. There are, as I say, a lot of them. They're doing a lot of shooting. They get into a good fight with the Nazis. That stuff, as you said, is quite good. Probably like all the elements in the story, it feels as though the writer doesn't quite know what to do with them in the end. Yeah.
And again, it's the more action-oriented scenes, because I'll tell you, Dave, there's a scene in this story that I think, despite what I've just said about this story overall, is better than the Dalek fight at Coal Hill School with Ace versus the Daleks. And it's when the Cybermen are after Ace while the Doctor's faffing around with Nemesis. There's this tremendous long shot, and you see Sophie running like full tilt, Tom Cruise style. She's bolting, and these explosions are going off very, very close to her, and it just looks amazing. And then soon after, she's stalking the Cybermen with her slingshot. That's quite realistic, like the way she uses the angles of the stairwell to sort of get them before they get her. And I think that whole segment's great, and it ends with that standoff where she's only got one coin and 3 Cybermen. It's like this sort of Mexican standoff. I think it's really good.
Yeah, that use of the outdoor filming environment, and this is the corollary of doing the whole of the Happiness Patrol indoors, is they get to do the whole of the Silver Nemesis outdoors. And it does look good. They do make great use of those scenes and those shots. The one that I was going to highlight is the shot of Ace on the gantry above the TARDIS and the Nemesis and everything, where it looks like she's way up high. And if you talk to Sophie Aldred about it, it's very clear that occupational health and safety would not remotely have allowed her to do that these days, because it was this rusty old gantry quite a way up. But yeah, there's some great filming in here. There's an energy to this one that I really like. It's fun. It just doesn't know what to do with all the elements once they're introduced. Part 1's really good. I watched the part 1 the other night for the podcast, and all the introduction of all these elements building up to that cliffhanger with the Cybermen and the battle at the start of part 2 is really good. It's after that you just go, they didn't have an ending for this when they wrote it, did they?
I know we haven't got to the next story, but is this the weak one of the season?
Objectively, I think it is.
Okay.
It's not my least favourite.
Okay. Shall we get on to the final one, the greatest show in the galaxy?
Yeah, lead us off, Rob.
Alrighty. Again, thinking back to being a kid, because this is when I originally saw it, I didn't think there was much to this at all. I mean, it was good to have the location shooting. It made the planet feel realistic, and of course, the location shooting in the real circus tent because of the asbestos at the BBC, that made it look pretty good inside the tent as well. It looks a little cheap, though, when we get to the actual dark circus, and everything looks like basically styrofoam, because we know it's got to all fall apart at the end, so it needs to be styrofoam. But again, like the Happiness Patrol, as an adult, I can sort of let that go and just immerse in the story, and it's an interesting little drama. I mean, the chief clown is scary and weird, the conductor's an odd-looking thing, and when Kablam came out, I thought there was an instant sort of recognition between the Kablam man and the conductor in this story. Very similar look. Mags and the captain are very memorable. There are episodes of New Who that go by and I forget half the characters and the other half I don't know their names. But here, it's like watching, I don't know, a big franchise movie or something. I seem to know all the characters and remember them. Now, is it because they're memorable, or is it because I watched it when I was a kid and my brain was more plastic or elastic or whatever the expression is? I don't know. But it just feels more memorable than a lot of Doctor Who does to me, the characters here. Interesting.
So this was a story that I did see at the Doctor Who Club. So I saw it with a bunch of fans at a hall, right the way through, the 4 episodes, one after the other. As an 8-year-old, my main memory of this was being slightly bored.
Okay.
It's sort of lots of people driving around deserts. It's lots of people talking at each other. It's lots of people doing strange and weird things. And as an 8-year-old, that's not what I wanted. As an adult, I realise now that some of that stuff that's two people talking to each other is quite witty. Some of it's quite profound. Some of it's quite poignant. There are scenes in this that I am a big fan of. Stuff with the Chief Clown, as you've said, he's an amazing villain. He's really well done. Some of that stuff early on with Flower Child, and then later on with Deadbeat and with Bellboy, that actually is quite poignant and it's quite well done. That said, though, this feels like less than the sum of its parts for me. This is one of those Doctor Who stories that I know a lot of fans adore, and I know how much they love it. And I have tried many times to see this through their eyes, and it just doesn't land for me. I don't quite know why it does for some and not for me, but it doesn't. I like a lot of the pieces, I stress that. It doesn't gel as a story for me.
Do you like Captain Cook?
No.
No?
And let me say, I have never understood the deal around T.P. McKenna. He turns up in an episode of Blake 7 and he's boring. He turns up in an episode of Rumpole and he's annoying. And he turns up here and he's just talking nonsense. And I kind of see what they may be trying to do, but he's just a boring, unpleasant character. And T.P. McKenna has never, as an actor, ever engaged me.
Interesting.
Interesting. Does he work for you?
As a character, I thought, the concept of, I mean, what does he look like? What sort of era? It's not Edwardian. It's probably earlier than that. It's probably,
the Victorian pith
Victorian, yeah. He's got that sort of vibe, but he's going around the galaxy. I mean, I find that sort of a really marvellous sort of image. The same as, I like to think of the Doctor as being like a 19th century gentleman, but at the controls of the TARDIS. I like that kind of look. As an actor, maybe I don't have an opinion on him, but as a character, I found that interesting.
I do wonder whether there are occasions in this script, which is written by Stephen Wyatt, we should point out, who's back after doing Paradise Towers, which is a story I actually really do enjoy, and for all its production faults, I really like the story of Paradise Towers. I think on this occasion, Wyatt is perhaps on occasion being a bit too clever by half. I suspect that Captain Cook is meant to be this sort of meta take on the Doctor, this old guy with lots of stories who travels around with a young girl for no apparent reason, doing strange things. Like it's meant to be a clever take on the Doctor, but I don't get why and what the point is. In the same way that the Whiz Kid is presumably meant to be a riff on fanatics and devoted fans, not necessarily of Doctor Who per se, but with all those lines about, I obviously never saw it in the old days, but I know it was much better then. All those sort of things. Like, I get what they're trying to do. I just think they're being a bit too clever. And it doesn't land for me. But again, I totally get why, if that clicks for you, it would absolutely land for you. But yeah, lots of great visuals. The bus conductor as well, that was another thing. That was one thing as a kid that I do remember sort of being quite creepy and quite chilling. There's lots of good stuff in here.
Oh, I think there is. Again, as a kid, I didn't think there was much to it. It got better as an adult. I still don't think it's the best of this season. But it seems like I like it a little bit more than you.
Do you think it goes up or down when they actually get to the Gods of Ragnarok in part 4? Now, I agree that it obviously looks cheap, and it's clearly hurt by the fact that they had to film it in a car park. And whilst that benefits where they do the stuff inside the tent, because, hey, it's a real tent now, clearly trying to do that in a car park rather than on a soundstage was not ideal, and it doesn't quite work. But do the Gods of Ragnarok work for you?
No.
Yeah, me either. I think that's where the story really falls down. And I certainly remember a lot of fans at the time saying, you know what, it's not the best story, but it was going along, it was kind of ticking along. I liked it. I liked the Chief Clown. The family was creepy. I was wondering what was going on. Then they got to the Gods of Ragnarok, and I'm like, huh?
Yeah, the stakes just get too big for what it is.
Yeah.
If I can just say it as simply as that, it just seems ridiculous that we go from this weird psychic circus to gods, all-powerful gods, watching people juggle and things, and it's like, oh, really?
Yeah, it perhaps lacks the money to do epic. I think, again, if this was done as a new series story, you could imagine there being a lot more members of the psychic circus. Not necessarily action characters, but there would be other people in the background. There'll be other people coming in. Maybe there would be a bit more of an audience. It just sort of never quite works that, like there's one person in the audience at any time and the acts, and they sort of keep churning through. I sound like I'm really down on this story, which I'm not. I'm not down on any story in this season. I can watch them all quite happily. I just think that lots of lovely bits in this don't make a coherent story and don't work in the end. One thing I will say that's very positive about it, though, it is really clear by this stage that McCoy has absolutely nailed the Doctor. He is really good in Remembrance of the Daleks. A big step up from where he was in season 24. But by this time he gets to The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, he has absolutely nailed who his Doctor is. He's got the gravitas, he's got the oomph, he's got the dark and the light, he's got the fun, he's got the chilling. This is perhaps one of the best performances McCoy gives. I think that there's a couple in the next season to better it, but I think that he's a real strength in this.
Yeah, and look, this was originally going to be, I think, second in the season. It got messed around because of the asbestos thing. I think they did their location filming first, then got messed around.
Yeah, and JNT also wanted Silver Nemesis to go out on the anniversary.
That's right, and that was going to be another nice advantage if they went with the Happiness Patrol second. No, I just thought I'd mention that as well.
I think there are 4 good stories in here, but if I had to rank them, I would actually rank them in the order in which they're broadcast.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
For my personal enjoyment, I think The Greatest Show is a better written and better made story than Silver Nemesis. But I could enjoy Silver Nemesis more than I enjoy Greatest Show. But I watched them all. I mean, I watched them all for this podcast very, very happily. They went down very easily.
Oh, they do. They really do. I was surprised, actually. There are some movies I can watch, not just the big ones like Star Wars and stuff, but there are movies like Top Gun and things where I know what dialogue is coming next because I've just seen it so many times. And I didn't think that was actually the case with this season of Doctor Who, yet I was actually having lines of dialogue pop into my head before they were being delivered. And I thought, geez, I know this a lot better than I thought I did. So yeah, it did go down very well. Dave, I think before we summarise, we should talk about the Doctor and Ace, because this is their first season together. Sophie was in Dragonfire, of course, but wasn't really the companion until the very end. What do you think about the Doctor and Ace?
It's not a new or an original thought to say that the chemistry between McCoy and Aldred is far better than the chemistry between McCoy and Bonnie Langford, who was, as we said in our episode about companions that overlap two doctors. She was designed to work for Colin, and I think works for Colin. She doesn't work for Sylvester. The relationship between them is evident right from that first part in Remembrance of the Daleks. She as a character is given a lot to do, and I think the fact that McCoy has now found his feet as the Doctor means that he can sort of pull Sophie Aldred along with him, and she's got a really strong established character to play off. But the relationship and the rapport between them is natural. You can't fake that.
Oh, I agree. I've jotted down here, I don't think there are many better pairings in all of Doctor Who. I mean, you think of Tom and Liz, you think of John and Katie, you think of Pat and Fraser. I think Sylvester and Sophie are without doubt in that company, without any doubt at all, actually, in my mind. Pull out any other classic pairing and see if they stack up better. Colin and Nicola? No. Davo and Janet? No.
No, but both great characters, but not a great pairing. You're right.
Yeah. I mean, Hartnell did very well with Hill and Russell, but that's a different dynamic because, it's a pair rather than just a younger sort of solo companion. I'll actually go a step further, Dave, here tonight on the Doctor Who show and say I think they're possibly the best classic Doctor Who pairing, but don't get the respect they deserve because of where the show was at when they were in it.
No, I think you're right. Look, are they definitely the absolute number one? I mean, I would probably fight you on that because I think you got Tom and Liz in there and maybe Fraser and Pat, but they're a podium finish.
Yeah, I mean, Sophie is just so dynamic and action-oriented, as we've talked about here tonight. And, she gets dialogue that's a bit cringe every now and then, but I think she really is the start of New Who in many ways. There's a scene, I don't know if it was Nemesis or the Happiness Patrol, might have been the Happiness Patrol, where she's just raging about something. She's really pissed off with somebody. And Sylv grabs her and he starts snarling, calm down, I need you, but not like this, and it's a really sort of modern dialogue and acting, which I just don't imagine Tom doing with Liz or John doing with Katie, or, it's just really interesting. I'm not describing that very well. It is this crossover point between different kinds of TV, I think, somehow.
Look, I think that this is a very nice confluence of all the things we've been talking about. Not only is McCoy landing the role, but Cartmel is writing the scripts better and Sophie is allowed to do more with what she gets. Sophie is allowed, or Ace I should say, is allowed to have relationships. She's allowed to have crushes. She's allowed to be happy and sad. She's allowed to be scared at the right times but brave at other times. There's a wonderful scene in Happiness Patrol where she's there with Leslie Dunlop's character and she gets the whole little dialogue about how, I can't sing, I can't dance, actually, I haven't got any talents whatsoever, and it feels like a very real person. And then, later on she gets that moment, I want to make them very, very unhappy. And that feels again like a real person being upset and being angry. She gets moments again in Greatest Show that are like that. Yeah, she's allowed more poignant moments than I think Janet Fielding got, than Nicola got, certainly than Leela got, for example.
Well, just talking about Leela, I mean, I mentioned how dynamic and action-oriented she is. Leela's this warrior woman. She doesn't get half the action scenes that Sophie gets, a quarter of the action scenes that Sophie gets. It's pretty tame the way they used to treat a companion like her back in the day, even given her background. Fast forward to Ace and she's jumping through windows and being shot at, and it's just a whole different ballgame. You can't even compare them.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think you're also absolutely right that the very first seeds of what would become not just the McCoy era, but the new adventures after that, and from there, the new series of Doctor Who, are absolutely laid in this season. Rob, I've got to ask you though, I've sort of said what my 1, 2, 3, 4 would be. What's at least your number 1, number 2?
Oh, it's the same as you. Remembrance first, absolutely, and Happiness Patrol second, absolutely.
It's really impressive how, I think over the last 10 years particularly, Remembrance has slowly just worked its way up in fandom and now sits, I think, as a pretty undisputed, genuine classic of the show.
Oh, personally, I felt that way the first time I saw it. But I know what you're saying, in fandom more broadly, yes. Okay.
It was certainly very well regarded when it came out, and I think for a long time it was seen as certainly the best of the first couple of McCoy seasons, if not the McCoy era. But I think it's just sort of gone from, you know, being very good to being, this is a classic. And I think partly as well because fans are sometimes a bit reluctant to afford classic status to, if not the whole JNT era, certainly the back end of the JNT era. And it did suffer from being part of the McCoy era. And look, I've got my faults with the McCoy era, and indeed with McCoy as an actor. But this is a very well-made, well-written series to watch. And my final point on it all is that for the first time in a long time in Doctor Who, these are a set of stories that are about something. Sometimes it's just a really important vibe. Sometimes it's a more direct message. Sometimes it lands well. Sometimes it's a little bit awkward. But it's Doctor Who made well, written well, and about something.
For me, I think this is a good season. It's neck and neck with season 26 for me. You know, I think in season 26 you've got Battlefield as the weak link. Here I think it's Silver Nemesis as the weak link. Otherwise, 3 other quite good stories. Look, for the budget it was made for the relative experience of the people making it, we mentioned Remembrance was Aronovich's first script. I think this season does something pretty amazing that at least seasons, 22, 23, 24 could only dream of. It's good. No, it's more than good. It's great.
I have to ask, because you sort of alluded to it there, do you think that because Andrew Cartmel was so on top of hiring the writers and getting the scripts done, suddenly JNT was allowed to go back to what he was always really, really good at, which is making the budget work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was still interfering in the background. Another one of those extras I watched, Cartmel was saying, you know, John had come up with this name, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, and said, here, go and write this show. And I was like, oh, Christ, you know. So he was still interfering a little. But yes, broadly, I think it did help that he had someone on his side and who he felt comfortable with and who he would back and go to the mat for as well.
Yeah.
You know, a really great pairing, and they did amazing things in this back end of his time.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's really clear that we both really enjoy this season.
We really did. But what did our listeners think, Dave?
As I alluded to at the start of this show, we had a lot of feedback, and I think that just shows how many listeners really love this season and were engaged right into us. The first of them was Dwayne Bunny from the Sirens of Audio podcast, and he tweeted into us, I'll never forget the first episode of The Crappiness Patrol, as I used to call it, especially the head shaking of James Valentine after the closing credits and the sheer embarrassment I felt. Now in my older years, I consider this to be a fantastic story.
Yeah, and I think we both concur with that.
Very much so.
All right. Millie McKenzie, creator of fabulous Doctor Who figurines, wrote to us on Facebook. She says, this series has my favourite 80s story, The Happiness Patrol. I won't talk about the others, they get love and praise heaped on them, especially Remembrance, but I feel Happiness is often ridiculed. I adore it. The sets are gorgeous, especially Candyman's kitchen with the black and white decor, reminiscent of silent German expressionist films. There we go, I was talking about that earlier myself.
You were, yes.
And the streets give off vibes of 40s film noir. The members of the patrol are aging, and their makeup is crumbling, their smiles are forced, and the skimpy pink outfits are uncomfortable. The villain is so layered, she is bitter and haggard and angry with the world. She pretends to be happy, and wants everyone to be happy without fully understanding what happiness truly is. She loves her pet more than anything else, and her soul is utterly destroyed when he is killed. Basically, Helen A is me. The other 3 stories are good. It's a solid series. Thanks, Millie.
That's really good, Millie, and I'm just reminded of another one of those wonderful Helen A moments where she's rewarding somebody and giving them promotion, and he says, oh, thank you very much, Mum, I'm aiming for the top. And she just looks at him, not quite the very top, I hope. I love it.
You sounded almost like Tim Brooke Taylor then doing Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, thank you very much. Dan Pym writes in to us via Twitter. One of my absolute favourites. I remember vividly the experience of sitting down and watching Remembrance as a 10-year-old. That first cliffhanger of the Dalek floating up the stairs blew my mind. Remembrance is an almost perfect story, and the first since Davo in Caves. Happiness Patrol? Great story let down by some production values. Imagine it with better, moodier lighting. Silver Nemesis is a fun romp, although poor use of the Cybermen. And it ends with another classic, the spooky Greatest Show. Clowns are creepy. Seventh and Ace, what a great double act.
Yeah, I agree with all of that as well. John Arnold tweeting to us from _Arn. He says, my absolute favourite series, perfect balance of the goofiness and fun of the previous season and the darker of the next season. 3 out-and-out classics, and even Silver Nemesis is a lot of fun.
Very fair. Pat Howard tweets in at Patrick J. Fury. Morning, Rob and Dave. Thanks for a great run of shows this year. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't want to be contentious, but in relation to the McCoy era, I have wanted to ask you about this for a while. I was obsessive about Doctor Who growing up and then struggled after Tom Baker left. The hammer blow for me was the direction and acting in the McCoy period. I find the lead actors throughout to be near unwatchable.
Wow.
Having heard the stories discussed positively on yours and other podcasts, this rarely seems to be mentioned. I have tried watching recently and I can see the tone and ideas are better than they have been for a while, but fail to see any appeal in the wooden and patronising acting style. Ace seems to be hugely popular with fans, but I cannot understand why. Please explain. Look, we've just had a whole episode, so I won't go too far into that if you don't mind, Pat, but I'll make 2 quick points. One is, I don't think that McCoy is a very good actor, and he's probably one of the weaker ones to play the Doctor. But I do think by the time we get to season 25 and certainly 26, the script team know what he's best at, and they write to that. And I think that you do see, therefore, him doing what he's best at here. Look, Ace, I think he was just such a breath of fresh air at the time, and just exciting and well acted. And if it doesn't land for you, then that's fine. You know, as I said, other things don't land for me. But when you look at what had come before, so fresh. That's my take.
Yeah, and look, I just waxed lyrical about Ace towards the end of that piece myself. Just the action she was given, the lines she was given, and this feeling, not that we knew who was coming, of course, but now that we can look back, we can sort of see the start of an acting style and lines and dialogue that sort of fit more with more modern Who than classic Who. And maybe, Pat, you just like classic Who, and that's why it sticks out, and that's why you don't like it. I don't know. You know, there are bands musically that people adore and I absolutely hate, and I'm sure they look at me and say, why do you hate this? I love this. You know, and here, I think this is great, but if it doesn't land for you, then I guess it just doesn't land, you know?
Yeah, Benedict Cumberbatch is that for me. I generally do not know why he gets paid to be an actor. but millions love him, so what do I know?
Yeah, it can be like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on, Greg Jamieson from the Complete Menagerie podcast, one of my favourite Doctor Who podcasts, I have to say. Greg says, Sylvester comes into his own. Starts with an outright classic, shame about the student politics of Happiness Patrol and the unholy mess of Silver Nemesis, though at least they got Anton Diffring in it just in time. Dead now. Greatest show was Doctor Who back at its creepy best.
Very fair. Ava S. Jones tweets to us, I think it's Seven's best series. It contains Remembrance of the Daleks, which is one of my favourite episodes in all, and really does seem to be a high point for 80s Who in general. The only bad bit of it is Silver Nemesis, which is really quite, not good.
Very good, Ava. Philip Edney, the other half of the Sirens of Audio podcast, writes to us on Facebook. He says, everything about season 25 was a breath of fresh air. Although the previous season had been okay, this season just nailed everything. Sylvester had found his Doctor, controlling from the shadows, allowing all characters to have a voice, manipulating situations but able to step in and take command at a moment's notice. Funny, mysterious, vengeful but still friendly, like an uncle. Ace was such an intriguing character, and we now had a companion with a story arc, a first for the show. In fact, Ace was pushed into the spotlight as a character, with the Doctor working more behind the scenes, much like Ian and Barbara. It felt like the Doctor and Ace had been travelling together for ages, because they just got each other. The chemistry between Sylvester and Sophie was just perfect. Although tragically not enough stories, real thought had gone into the balance. Each story offered something different, and the addition of the quirky story was a real boost. Daleks and Cybermen, circuses and despots. Brilliant! Production values had also stepped up so much it felt like the show had really come of age.
I think we agreed with a lot of that.
Very much so. Good call, Philip.
One on Facebook from Jeff Waddell. Now, Rob, I yesterday read a 152-page submission to the Australian Electoral Commission from someone called Jeff Waddell. I don't think it's the same one, but Jeff, if it was, I loved your work.
Were there any mentions of Scotland in it?
No, which is why I suspect it wasn't.
Okay.
There you go. Spelt the same and everything. I was quite impressed.
Yeah.
Jeff says, Remembrance is the best classic Dalek story of them all. Happiness is a great dystopian tale, and even the Candyman is wonderfully macabre. Silver is better than most fandom says it is, and Greatest is a weird tale that has some very dark undertones. A wonderful short season, boosted by the chemistry of McCoy and Aldred, with real hints of a darker Doctor. Great season after years of treading water at best.
Again, agree.
Yeah.
And finally, Mark Inslee writes to us on Facebook. Growing up, I would watch classic Doctor Who on Saturdays on UK TV Gold. They did the whole run of McCoy and I loved it all. However, I often found myself having to defend Doctor Who to my family, who would mock and criticise its dated visuals and effects. I remember feeling acute embarrassment when I was walked in on watching the Happiness Patrol. How could I defend a robot made of licorice all sorts? How could I convince them it wasn't silly? It was met with much derision and mocking from my family. Throughout my childhood, this had been a Doctor Who story I would associate with feelings of embarrassment for the show I love so dearly. I now look at it with absolute fondness. It is dark, clever, and utterly prescient. I now appreciate and understand the subtle political messages of this piece far better, and I find the saccharine Candyman to be an unsettling and nightmarish foe. Also, Earl Sigma was one of my inspirations for learning to play the harmonica. All this makes it one of my favourite stories. Also, I have fond memories of memorising the Ringmaster's opening rap from The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. Wow.
Oh, that's very cool, Mark. And look, I will actually mention as well that I've said before on the podcast, Dominic Glynn is my favourite Doctor Who composer, and I should have said the score that he has for the Happiness Patrol with that harmonica theme is really beautifully done and is so different to what you normally get in Doctor Who that, again, there's a sense of freshness and innovation that just comes through in the music as well. It's just, yeah, really good season.
And in the next series, is it Dominic who cracks out the guitar for Survival?
In Survival, yes, that's right.
Yeah, he was great.
He was. So that's season 25, Rob. I enjoyed that.
I feel like we only scratched the surface, you know?
That's true. It's a series that actually genuinely has layers and actually has a lot going on, and so there is a lot to talk about. But look, don't take our word for it. Just go and watch it.
Yeah, and do, if you can, grab the Target novelizations and basically get an extended version of the stories through reading those. Yeah,
they are 4 very good books, absolutely.
Yeah. Look, to close quickly, Dave, let's run through what we're watching. I want to just say I've just finished 90 episodes of All Creatures Great and Small, which was a bit of a punish at times, but I'm glad I did it. If you ever want to do it, the first 3 seasons really are the best. Once they revive it, back in 1988, it's more of a greatest hits package of things they've already done. I'm glad I watched it, though. I've got to the end, and now I'm just finishing off the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes at the moment, as for what I'm watching on TV.
Oh, very nice. Look, as I mentioned at the start of the show, I've been watching some Joss Whedon. As I've mentioned before, I've now finished season 2 of The Boys, and I was really quite impressed with the way they kept that fresh and took it in a direction I wasn't expecting, so that was very cool. I discovered, I don't know how, the algorithm found for me on YouTube episodes of Up Pompeii, which I'd never seen before but heard of many times, and I watched a couple of those on YouTube, and I've got to say, as much as I knew some of the humour was not appropriate for now and today, I laughed a lot at some of it, I have to say. It was actually very funny.
Fantastic.
But looking forward to The Mandalorian coming out in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, very, very soon. Now, Dave, next month you pick the topic. Do you want to quickly explain what it is?
We are talking about alien worlds, and in particular we're going to be highlighting, each of us, what we think are the best portrayed alien worlds in Doctor Who. And we're going to leave it up to each other to quantify that and define that as we see fit. And we might also give a couple of shout-outs to some of the worst, I think, as well, just for a bit of fun.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to that.
Me too, but look, that's been a very fun episode. It's been fun talking about that series. It's one that I remember well from my childhood. yeah, that's all I have to say.
All right then. Well, until we talk Alien Worlds next month, or indeed until you and I talk in 2 weeks' time, Dave, on Primary Sources, I've been Rob.
And I've been Dave.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. You've been listening to The Doctor Who Show, the podcast where too much Doctor Who is barely enough. Subscribe to us on iTunes or listen through the website at www.thedwshow.net. Write to us at hello@thedwshow.net or send us a quickie on Twitter @thedwshow. Facebook.com/The DW Show is also a good place to find us if you're so inclined. Our version of the Doctor Who theme arranged by George Locke. Look him up on YouTube, folks. This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. Doctor Who, all names and sounds, and any other related items are trademarks and or copyrights of the BBC. All other trademarks and trade names are properties of their respective owners. The official Doctor Who website can be found at www.bbc.co.uk/Doctor Who.